It's time to rethink, renew, and reimagine retirement. Welcome to Retire Repurposed. This podcast is dedicated to help people transition into fulfilling and purposeful retirements. Retirement is a big life change. In fact, the two most dangerous years of a person's life are the year they were born and the year they retire. We believe that retirement is not the end, rather the beginning of what could be the most impactful season of a person's life. So don't retire, become repurposed. Well, I'm your host, Jared Sebest. I'm the co-founder of Retire Repurposed alongside Ben Tejas. Thank you so much for joining us today. Whether you're listening to us on the radio, maybe you're listening to us online, regardless, head over to iTunes, find our podcast, subscribe, and better yet, leave us a quick positive rating and review. If you just take a moment and do that, we would appreciate that so much. Now, this podcast is all about retirement, but it's not about money. It's about the non-financial parts of retirement, which many times can be more challenging than the financial. Few people can just flip the switch from working a career, having an identity, having a schedule, having habits, and then shutting them off on Retirement Friday without methodical steps to living what we call a repurposed retirement. If you want more for your life and your retirement, then you have come to the right place. Well, on this episode, we continue our series on retirement habits. Healthy habits are important at any time in your life, but especially in retirement. Time is one of your greatest assets if you are a retiree, but if you have bad habits, that time is going to work against you. Today, we covered the habit of reflecting. Reflection is an important piece of a retiree's life because it extracts the lessons out of your experiences and allows another way for God to build your faith. In this podcast, Ben talks about the two major times retirees should reflect, and he gives you a tool that has the power to create legacy for future generations. Enjoy this episode. All right, folks, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in here today. Before we get started, just a reminder, we've got a brand new Facebook group out there called Becoming Repurposed in Retirement. Join a growing community of people that refuse to accept the typical American dream retirement. If this is sparking interest with you, go to facebook.com, search Becoming Repurposed in Retirement to join this growing people who want to make retirement everything it was supposed to be. Again, thank you for joining us on the show here today. We got a great show. We're going to continue this series on retirement habits. And today we are going to talk about the habit of reflection. And this is, you may not think that this has anything to do with retirement. I got to tell you, this has a huge piece of the puzzle marked for your retirement and making it, helping you kind of come into God's fullness. So this is going to be a great show here for today. Ben Tejas joins me on the show right now. And Ben, we started this series a couple of shows back, but really it kind of comes down to this idea that if you're going to get into a bad habit, retirement is a bad time to get into bad habits.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into some bad habits when you have more time on your hands, right? And I know this just from experience. I think if you've lived, you know that if I'm not intentional and I'm not creating steps around what I do each day, I kind of lose track of time. You lose track of what you're doing. And we all know that it's much easier to drift downstream, right? That's naturally where you go in a place which is not as good. So by setting good habits, watching what you're doing and being intentional, you can have so much more fulfilling retirement.
It seems like if that momentum slows down in life, it's harder to get that momentum back up. And you got some things working against you. No disrespect to people that are in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, but to get that momentum picked back up and kind of, make a change or a shift, that becomes a little bit harder later in life. 2 episodes ago, we kicked off this series with developing a heart of gratitude. We felt like that is where we had to start when we're talking about habits.
Yeah, I think anytime you want to be happier in life, start by thinking about the positive things in your life, right? I mean, it sounds so common sense, but so many of us don't do it, right? We were doing that show, and it was around Thanksgiving time, and I can remember just thinking, so many times I personally don't practice enough gratitude. I tend to kind of have this negative feeling around me many times, and to get you out of that, it's not, you can't just try to think positive. You have to be full of gratitude, and your more positive feelings will come out of that.
Yeah, I think choosing joy is something we all need to hear. It's very easy to choose grumpy, negativity. That to me comes very easily. You have to be very intentional about choosing joy and choosing to have a joyful heart, like the Bible talks about.
Yeah, the Bible talks about, whenever you face trials, whenever things are hard. I mean, that's in James 1:2-3. That talks about considering actually joy when we go through hard times, and how it tests our faith, and how we build our faith out of really be grateful for those trials and temptations.
Last week we talked about positive self-talk. We talked about how many times the most destructive words that are said to us are the ones we conjure up in our own heads. And we went back to this old adage that everybody has heard, especially when they were young.
Yeah, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. So not true, whether other people are saying them, but even worse, if you're saying them to yourself, you start to believe them even more. So when you're thinking through the things that you're feeding yourself, both what you're reading, but more importantly than that, even what you're thinking about.
One thing I thought about that show is that we talked about how there's actually scientific studies done where if we have certain words or thoughts or ideas in our head, they actually can kind of manifest in a physical sense. If we're surrounded by negative self-talk or negativity in general, that almost comes out in a physical form many times.
Yeah, it actually reinforces, right, what we're thinking, and you start to see things. And we took some from the recent work by John Acuff in his book Soundtracks. We took some work that he had found and kind of applied that to retirees. I mean, it's so easy to get into the system or the feeling of, getting negative, and what that does to somebody's body, how that makes them, again, it just compounds the problems we've been talking about. James
Clear in his book Atomic Habits talks about how habits actually, we find identity out of those things. So if your identity is I'm retired and I'm old, guess what? You're going to start to act old. You're going to start to look old. You're going to feel old. Your body's going to respond to being old, and that is that's not in the scenario you want to be in.
No, we want our minds to be transformed, right? It says in Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I think about that verse a lot. I think there are so many patterns that I get caught up in day to day. It's like you get caught down this rabbit trail of negative thinking, or maybe it's whatever that pattern is, and to really get in the way of you living the most full retirement. Those patterns are there. You got to watch out for them. Make sure that you're allowing God to use your mind, and keeping it, positive self-talk is a big way, easy way to help get that done.
Absolutely. If you missed those episodes, go back on iTunes, subscribe while you're there, but make sure you listen to those shows. Very important stuff. Today, we're going to talk about the habit of reflecting. And like I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, you may not connect reflection with retirement, but this is not how we look at it. Ben, let's just start with, why is this habit of reflection so important?
Well, Jared, they're important because reflection and evaluation transform our experiences, our life experience, into insight and wisdom. Without reflection, you just don't learn anything from all those experiences.
Yeah, I think experiences are just experiences, and experiences aren't the only thing that develop your character. I think that they have to, you got to go beyond just the experience to kind of get the full horsepower out of what that experience is trying to teach you.
Yeah, good ones, bad ones. I can think of many times in my life where I've been through something really hard, and you can chalk it up to a bad day, or you can stop and you can spend the time to reflect and turn that into something that you can learn from. Turn that into insight, wisdom for the next time you go through something. So again, whether it be a positive or negative, actually taking and spending the time to reflect on those experiences makes the experience, turns into wisdom.
Yeah, I think if we start talking about this whole road of being repurposed in retirement, this comes up early in the game. So again, this idea of reflection and really understanding, God, what's God been trying to, how He's been trying to mold and shape you. This is the beginning. Well, let's talk about this for a second. What does reflection then help you do?
Yeah, I think we've been talking the last few shows about understanding yourself, right? Your image. I think reflection allows you to understand more of who you are, how God created you.
Yeah, I mean, it's no doubt that God will use experiences, good and bad, to kind of, again, mold and shape you. But again, there's some discovery that happens within you and within kind of the whole context of your life if you spend that time to actually intentionally reflect.
Yeah, and actually, most of those experiences we've been talking about, you have no idea what God is doing in your life during the actual experience. In fact, many times it takes years and years for you to come back and say, oh, that's what he was doing in my life.
Right.
I've had those times. I know I've even talked about it on this show before, but reflecting on illnesses for people is tough, right? I mean, you've had so many people lately. I can think of a few folks that I've had a chance to just walk life with lately that have been through some major health concerns.
Yep.
And almost every time that they do that, they start reflecting on what it taught them, what those low points taught them about themselves, about how they interact with others, or just how to love people better and how to notice what people are going through. So there's so many times that we go through hard stuff. We don't spend the time to really look at what's God doing, and we never know until it seems like it's months down the road.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point for people to hear, maybe that are in a tough spot. Hindsight's always 20/20, and there will certainly be a time where we'll all be able to understand why these things happen. But it certainly helps us in the near term to reflect on those past experiences. Also, too, I think it's really important for people to understand just about the experiences they've had. And if you look at baby boomers, retirees, I mean, they've had a lot of life experiences. And on top of that, look at how much the world has changed in their lifetime, even just in the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's something really valuable that most retirees don't completely give themselves credit for.
I would
Jared.
agree. Yeah.
They have so much history there that you can go by and just say, yeah, I was around for September 11, or I was living during the 90s recession, or the different wars that we've been through in these recent years, and or go beyond that, before that, where you saw just huge events throughout history that you've lived through. You have to give yourself credit for those really the experiences that you've had and reflect on what they've taught you.
Mm-hmm. The big one that sticks out in my mind is obviously the trials that we've been through in the last couple of years with COVID, the pandemic. There is something that was really targeting retirees in a lot of ways. Now, would you say, is it too early, too late to reflect on kind of how you felt during those, years of kind of going through a very uncertain time?
Yeah, super important to look at that and realize what you've come through, to take a step back and say, okay, specifically, one of the worst things, I mean, we're talking about this all the time, how bad isolation is for people, and especially if you're retired. That is one of the things we tell people: never get isolated. And now, for a few years ago, we were told you have to be isolated from others, and to live through that and not seeing people smile. I'm sorry, Jared, but when you can't see somebody's face because they're behind a mask and they're smiling, it's hard. I think of so many things that people have come through in the last couple of years, even travel. I mean, it might sound like a small thing, but there are people out there that were planning on all these trips and stuff, and now, a few years ago they were afraid to do it, and some of them are still living in that spot of, I'm not quite ready because I'm scared, right? So if you've come through these last couple of years, recognize, both what you've been through, but then take time to stop and just make an accounting, a reflection of all of the things that you've been through lately, and start to look at what it's been teaching you about yourself. Yep. I think we learned the most when we've been broken down a little bit. And certainly, I know in my life, I found out that when I'm broken down, when I'm hurting, God tends to show himself a little bit more versus me just when things are going great, feeling as if I don't need him. Right. That's definitely a temptation for all of us.
I think taking inventory on those emotions, those thoughts, how you felt, I think that's a really, really healthy habit to get into. When does a retiree practice this habit of reflection? We're telling people to reflect. What does it mean? What's the frequency? How should it look?
Well, I think there's kind of two things we'll talk about there, Jared, right? We'll talk about this immediate time right after retirement. So many people, and I've said this too. In fact, I wrote it in my book, Repurposed. I put, are you retiring to something or just from something? And it was always, don't retire from something, retire to something. Get started, do something right away. And if I could go back, I mean, I still believe that. I want people to keep purpose in their life. That's very important. Yeah. but definitely have a Sabbath time, if you will, a rest time where maybe it's a few months, maybe it's 6 months even, maybe even longer, where you're able to say, okay, I'm retired now. Don't jump into the next thing. Don't jump into something immediately. But know during that time that it is so important that you reflect both on the changes that are going around in your life, and also, the changes that your family's seeing in you. It is a major life thing, so you have to take a step back and reflect on what's going on through retirement.
We coach a lot of retirees through this process. This always comes up of this intentional time of reflection, and that goes for everybody. The amount of time, I would say, that is spent in this initial intentional time of reflection depends on your personality. So a little shout out to our last series that we did on retirement personalities, because kind of how God created you, that might dictate how much time you need. And whether it happens just after retirement, maybe just pre-retirement, whether it's a month, 6 months, a year, again, that all just kind of depends on your personality, but there needs to be some intentional time right before or right after retirement. What's another time that people should be doing this?
Well, I think every day, right? So daily, when you're starting each and every day with some gratitude, we talked about that in our last show, great habit to get into. Start and end each day with gratitude, and maybe spend some time at the end of the day just journaling. Maybe use that as your time. So daily you can kind of just sit back and think about all the things that you learned from that day and reflect upon them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you do that, that's going to give you some, maybe some decompression, some processing. Lots of times too, life just happens, and if you don't take that intentional time, you get you lose track of some of these experiences that can be exploited for some wisdom and some insight. Again, there's no doubt, like, God is giving you opportunities every day through experiences, good and bad, to mold and shape you. But if we never take that time, whether it's a quiet time to just reflect, meditate on word, on the word, or journal like you mentioned, you're missing out on opportunities to do this. Let's talk about journaling, because I think this is probably one of the major ways that people can reflect. Do you have to journal to reflect? Of course you don't, but this can be a real important thing, or at least becomes an important thing for retirees.
Yeah, it does. I think it's, I personally struggle with just staying in a rhythm of journaling. But I know in my life, when I'm going through stuff, it is so helpful when I can just write down how I'm feeling. For a retiree today, if you can begin just looking at yourself through self-awareness, I think journaling really helps you see patterns, helps you see things that you see over and over again.
Yeah, I think if you spend some time and do that, you're going to see things uncovered about yourself that you may not even knew that were there. You know what I mean? I think one common theme that happens for somebody who maybe has never journaled or really done some serious self-inventory or some self-reflection is that, this is a warning, if you do it, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find stuff in there. You know what I mean? You're going to find, God's going to uncover things in your heart, fallacies in how you think, fallacies maybe in your viewpoint on people. And when you start writing that down, you're going to give yourselves a platform to get some of that stuff out. And I do think that people may struggle if they've never done this and think like, wow, I've got a lot of problems out there. Maybe I got more than I thought, and maybe have more than the next person. But the truth is that if we were all honest with ourselves, there's stuff inside of us that may need healing, reconciliation, grace. And again, journaling can be that tool that really puts self-awareness in overdrive.
Yeah, and allows you to, again, take some inventory. Mm-hmm. And if you can put down some of these common feelings that you've been having, and then see those, it might help you overcome some fear. Yeah. Maybe you see this thing and you say, okay, maybe it's not as scary when I stop and reflect on what I'm dealing with.
Sure.
Maybe it's causing me more anxiety than the things actually should be.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Another benefit of journaling is it builds faith. I think this is a really important one, because it can, again, help you connect the dots between your life experiences and how God's trying to work in your life. It was funny, just last weekend we had some company over, and of course we were talking about life and having a very spirited conversation. And different times throughout the conversation, it was like, hey, remember that story? Remember that time that door just like miraculously opened. I'll tell you just from personal experience that if I try to force doors open, they may open, but they open with a lot of resistance, right? If you submit and you just try to get in God's will, doors tend to open up very quickly. Well, I've had a couple of, very, very fun experiences with this. The first one was where I was going to propose to my wife, where I felt like God just had his hand on me. He wasn't going to open the next door. This is early on in my TV career. And I actually remember telling one of my friends, I go, I feel like if I make the commitment to my girlfriend at the time to become my wife someday, then, maybe within 6 to 12 months down the road, God will open that door where I can, get the next job. And, because I felt like I was being called to something bigger and better. This is, again, 20 years ago. And I remember making the commitment and buying the ring that she wanted. I knew which one she wanted. I knew the jewelry store, made the phone call, and bought it. And I kid you not, 1 hour later, I got a phone call from Phoenix, Arizona, from a gentleman who became my future boss 30 days later. And it only took an hour. And if I don't write that stuff down and reflect on it, I forget it, and then you get into life and you're like, man, is God there? Is he working? Is he faithful? Is really what the Bible says, is it true? And again, it came up this weekend. We were chatting with friends. It's like, we need to be better at writing this stuff down because it connects the dots. And if you reflect on it, it's more top of mind. So when you get into a situation like that, you're more apt to remember it and have more faith. So I think faith building is a huge part of this.
Yeah, you can draw upon that experience. So much better if you've written it down and see what God has been doing in your life. I mean, there's always a connection there. Mm-hmm. And like we said earlier, you might not see it until you actually spend some time writing it down.
Yeah, I think another thing too is that if you're going to spend some time journaling or reflecting, you're going to be way more observational throughout the day. And that's a big piece of it too.
Yeah, you actually look for things, right? I think we're so much better when we know there's some accountability there. It's like, what am I doing with this day? I at night, I'm going to write down what I did today and some of the things that I observed, some of the things that I learned. And if you're doing that, it allows you really to end your day with kind of a win, right?
Yeah.
You say, hey, I know I took stock of some things in my life, noticed people, and wrote it down. And the next day I'm looking for the same thing.
We mentioned how the last hour of the day is one of the most important hours of your day. So again, I can't think of a better way to spend that hour. Again, having a heart of gratitude, maybe doing some journaling, but at the very least having some reflection time and some accountability, like you just said. The final thing we want to talk about as far as the benefits of journaling is legacy. And we're huge legacy proponents and talk about that a lot on the podcast, but this can be another tool in that arsenal.
Yeah, what a gift, right? If you could give an old journal written out, and you could think about if you could receive that from your grandparents, right? Your grandpa always wrote down a few key things, and you can take that out and really learn from him directly. I think that's so powerful years down the road to be able to do that, but even shorter term, right? Mm-hmm. If we're writing things down, we know that the very best way to leave a legacy is make a huge impact on others. So I heard a sermon recently by a guy named Jeff Schmitz, and if you're from our local area, you probably know that name. He's been a big person in the Ridgewater College area. He does a lot of work for the kingdom, feeds a lot of kids. He's got a great ministry he's doing over there, and he shared a story about his wife who passed away about a year ago, and he'd been married for 4 years, and when he shared some of that story, very real to him, right? It just happened. But I could tell that his words made a huge impact on my life. And I looked around our church and people were just like in awe of his story, right? And when we're able to write things down and you're able to then learn from both what you're going through, but then pass that, what you've learned on to the next person. He made a comment. He said, he's walked with some people through grief since that time. And what he was able to do for them was impacted by, losing his wife. And I tell you, that is such a powerful thing to use the hardships in our own life to benefit others. And God's got a plan. I mean, he kept saying that over and over. That's what got him through. And I think being able to share that with people around him, man, what a blessing to have those memories.
Well, I sure hope you enjoyed this conversation on retirement habits and reflection. Without reflection, your experiences are just that, they're experiences. But reflection bridges the gap between those experiences and more faith in God. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like a copy of Ben's book, Repurpose, The Untold Story of Retirement in America, just go to our website, retirerepurposed.com. Until next time, I'm Jared Sebesta. Remember, don't retire, become repurposed. We'll see you then.
Securities offered through Avantax Investment Services. Member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Avantax Advisory Services. Insurance services offered through an Avantax affiliated insurance agency.